to go ahead and call this meeting of the Cuyahoga County Investment Advisory Committee meeting to order. My name is Brad Cromis. I am the county treasurer. I'm joined today by members of my staff as well as by Council President Dale Miller and Katie Gallagher, who is here on behalf of the county executive. So, Eileen, with that said, can I have an official roll call so we can have that for the record?
Yes, thank you. Good afternoon. Can I have, is Chief Ronayne or Katie Gallagher, his designee? Here. Brad Cromis?
Present.
Dale Miller?
Here.
Everyone accounted for.
Okay, let the record reflect that we have a quorum. So, in going through today's agenda, the first item of business on all county meetings are public comments. Just by way of reference for those assembled in the room, we did adopt some rules for public comment at our meeting held July 24th, 2024. Public comment is limited to 3 minutes per speaker and a full limit of up to 10 speakers per meeting to allow us time to work through the committee's agenda in the course of any meeting. So having said that, do we have any public comment? It also requires, the completion of a slip to give public comments. So if you're interested in doing so, please complete a slip. This is our first meeting of the year, so we'll allow the opportunity to do that if you haven't already done so. Now, having said that, any public comment?
Yes, we have two people that signed up for public comment. First, we have Don Bryant.
All right, Don, please state your name for the record once you come to the podium up here.
Don Bryant. I would ask the county council and county council executive Ronayne to not continue to purchase the Israel bonds for basically two reasons. One, the bond rating has dropped considerably over the past year, and it doesn't feel like a very fruitful endeavor. But the main reason, even if it was a good investment, I would think that it is very unethical to be purchasing bonds from the nation of Israel while they're conducting a war on the Palestinian people. We've just seen the fruition of, there's a ceasefire in Gaza, but now the attacks are back in the West Bank of Palestine now in a refugee camp. So, and also, Israel has been conducting a 76-year military occupation of Palestine, and it's been deemed illegal. I don't see any smart investment in Israel bonds. I don't think this is a very prudent idea. It's unethical. I would give you a quote from E.F. Stone. Israel is creating a moral schizophrenia in world Jewry, and that is because many conscientious Jews in our country and in Israel feel that Israel is conducting, was a genocide. It's still considered a genocide by many. It's considered an apartheid state by Amnesty International and other human rights organizations. And, if you want to, if Cuyahoga County wants to continue supporting such actors on the world stage, why not buy Russia bonds? They're doing the same thing. They're occupying and they're attacking civilians mercilessly. So I don't see Israel being any more of a wonderful state in our world, and why not, compare them to Russia? It's a very similar situation. If you want to consider the fact that we're choosing sides, I've heard this said by Chris Ronayne, county executive. No, we're going to level the playing field by not buying Israel bonds. That's what my request is, that we discontinue the $16 million and the March 1st deadline of another $3 million requested. Yes, I think we should not proceed with that. Thank you.
All right, thank you, sir. Next.
Next is Richard Miller.
Hi, I'm Richard Miller. Thanks for the opportunity to address this committee. I appreciate it. I also want to discuss the issue of Israeli bonds. I don't want to look at it from a political perspective. You've probably heard enough of that. I want to come at this from an economic and financial perspective. I think these bonds provide a lot of risk and doubtful returns. In the past 13 months, I think the county has purchased $13 million on these Israeli bonds, raising the total holdings to about $16 million. And at the same period of time, the major rating agencies, S&P, Moody's, and Fitch, have downgraded these bonds, and all three agencies have issued negative outlooks for the bonds. As a result, the county is purchasing fixed-term bonds, as I understand it, for a fixed rate of interest. Now, when the bonds are downgraded, it means the risk goes up and the value of the bonds goes down. The county is not compensated for this decrease in or increase in risk that they're undertaking. As a result of this, these bonds become rather risky and underperforming investment. And additionally, while the bond rating agencies have published negative outlooks, there's a group of eminent Israeli economists and former finance ministers published an open letter and showed up in a number of Israeli papers. The letter was published in March of last year and signed by a number of economists, finance ministers, and they looked at the social, religious, and economic and demographic dimensions of Israeli society. And they came out with a rather dire warning. And I'll quote them. They say that all of these factors, the demographic, the economic, the social, are leading the country toward an abyss, one that poses a very real and grave threat to Israel's economy and society. The signatories of the letter include 100 prominent Israeli economists, including 73 professors from Israel's leading academic institutions. It includes multiple former director generals of the finance ministry and other former finance ministry senior officials. Something that should be taken seriously and something that I think speaks very negatively for any future investment in these bonds. So given that and given the deterioration of the bond ratings, given the negative outlook rate provided by the major bond rating agencies in this country, I think additional purchase of these bonds is not a good use of taxpayer money, and I would suggest or strongly urge the council to suspend any further investment in these bonds. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, thank you.
That ends public comment.
All right, thanks very much. Next item of business on the agenda is approval of the minutes from the October 22nd, 2024 meeting. Those were distributed prior to the meeting for members, and everyone should have had the opportunity to review. So with that said, do I have a motion to approve or accept those minutes as presented?
I'll move to approve.
Okay, moved. Would you second, sir, please?
I'll second.
All right, moved and seconded. Thank you very much. All in favor, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
No opposition or abstentions, so the motion carries. And with that, we are ready to have a conversation about our portfolio and funds. First, I would defer to our team internally here in Cuyahoga County to run through that, and then we'll have our friends from Meter Investment Management give us a broader look.
Okay, next slide, please. Okay, this slide is the, it has our funds, our asset allocation, and our compliance rates. And if you look at the top part is all of our bank deposits. These are our operating accounts that we work out of on a daily basis. All of our cash flows go in and out of these accounts.
Eileen, do
Yes.
you think we could blow that up? I mean, we have it in front of us, but is there any way to make it bigger on the screen? Thank you.
Okay, so our Star Ohio accounts, that's the state of Ohio money. That's our sweep that we work out of there when we need, for our daily operations, we go back and forth daily on, any money that's not being used immediately gets flown to the Star Ohio account. And then Key Bank, PNC, our US Bank are our normal accounts. I'm not going to go through the investments because Meter is going to do a more detailed report on the investments. And Jed can talk about the non-general funds like the opioid and money market account. Go ahead, Jed.
Next slide, please. And this slide shows the breakdown of our opioid funds. This is used to fund the diversion center. For those who've been paying close attention, you probably noticed that the money market accounts has increased. This is due to instruction from the opioid team, Brandy Carney and her team, who have identified that there's some uncertainty about how they're going to spend the money. And so she told us to stop reinvesting bonds and start building up that money market accounts for more flexibility of use. And the next slide, please. Well, this demonstrates the interest rate we're receiving on the Star Ohio balances that Eileen mentioned. This is our the money that we sweep over, essentially kind of think of that as savings. So if we have operational needs, we can pull from that. We try to get a higher rate at Star Ohio. With the Fed decreasing funds, we do like to keep money in long-term bonds to lock in higher rates, because you can see from that right side graph, those interest rates are declining as the Fed cuts rates. And I will turn over to Meter for a more in-depth look at our economic.
I'd like to pause there before we get to our friends from Meter.
Sure.
Is it any questions for our staff internally before we get to the Meter presentation?
No.
Okay,
No, thank
seeing
you.
none, thank you very much. All right, gentlemen, I believe the floor is yours.
Perfect. Thank you much. Good afternoon. For the new faces in the room, I am Jason Headings, so Senior Vice President with Meter Public Funds, and really work with the treasurer and his team on all of the day-to-day goings on within the portfolio. With me today, I have Jason Szabo, who will be giving a little update on our economy here. He serves as our Director of Fixed Income. And then wouldn't be complete without a third Jason on the call as well. Jason Click will be joining us to talk about the portfolio a little bit more, and President of Meter Public Funds. So with that, Mr. Szabo, we'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Jason. And if we can move to the next slide. So as it's very common and understandable, we all get very focused on the day-to-day, sort of week-to-week, month-to-month. It's certainly, as we flip to calendar years, it's generally interesting, helpful to gain a little bit of a broader perspective of all the things that have transpired over the course of a year. And certainly this 2024 has been no different than years past, of all the big changes that have occurred throughout the economy, throughout the capital market side specifically. And it really started with really on a global basis after this massive increase in interest rates from the major central banks as responding to the pandemic. We started to see global central banks begin to lower their policy rates as their economies all began to slow. Inflation started to improve significantly. And we've certainly seen here at home, the Federal Reserve, starting here in 2024, has reduced their policy rate by 1%, having gone from that peak of 5.5 to that 4.5% in 2024. Interesting things of coming into 2024. As we left 2023, there was broad expectations that the U.S. economy was going to slow, perhaps be in a recession. However, lo and behold, to just about everyone's surprise, is the economy remained incredibly resilient, really being supported from consumer spending. But some of the negative news is we've seen a big shift from the labor market side, and we're certainly going to dive a little bit more in detail later. But we saw the unemployment rate in 2023 at about 3.7%. However, as we got through November 2024, that started to increase all the way up to that 4.2%. So a significant shift on the underlying labor market throughout 2024. And really, some of the bigger fixed income moves, as we look at the 3-month Treasury bill ending last year, as it shouldn't be a surprise, with Fed funds rate at 5.5, 3-month Treasury bill was about that 5.33. Finished the year well below 5% and getting right around hovering that 4.31% area. The 2-year Treasury, despite all this volatility and change throughout from the Fed policy, changing dynamics in the economic growth front, The two-year Treasury actually remained relatively flat. It ended 2023 at 4.25 and then finished the 2024 at 4.24. However, slightly differently, and we'll get to in a little bit more detail as to some of the why in this last quarter, a little bit different from the 5-year Treasury, anticipating all the rate cuts. They finished 2023 at 3.85. But 2024, we actually saw the 5-year Treasury increase to close out 2024 and finished at that 4.38 mark. It would be not surprising maybe to everybody, but the equity markets increased for second consecutive year, finishing with at near all-time highs, up another 23% from 2024 on the back half of 2023, where the equity markets also had a significant year-over-year increase of about that 26%. So continued strong, equity front, in addition to a lot of activity from, the fixed income side. Then as we flip over to the next slide, we can dive into really a combination of the main drivers that are influencing the fixed income market and giving some perspective both from private economists and folks over at the Federal Reserve in terms of what they're thinking about in each of these key areas. So starting with federal funds rate, as we just left 2024 with the Fed reducing rates about 1% over the course of last year. They're expecting and communicating here from this last meeting in December, expecting to reduce rates even further by perhaps dropping them about 0.5% throughout 2025. We have the market also anticipating and thinking about where the policy rate will be at the end of 2025. And very similarly, the market is expecting policy rates to get reduced, but being reduced at a lower pace than what the Fed communicated in December. And we'll certainly talk through a little bit more detail as how much that has shifted and continues to shift over time. But this is where the market was expecting as we close out 2024. Then on the inflation front, there's been a lot of conversation and data and evidence that the inflation environment has been improving significantly, getting on its way closer to the Fed's 2% target. However, it's remained somewhat sticky and elevated above 2%, but broadly, economists are expecting over the course of 2025, the continuous trend, however bumpy, of getting closer to that 2% target over time and seeing by the end of 2025, at least the consumer price index being around that 2.5%. On the growth front, very similar. The growth story is expected to remain positive, but not as strong as we've seen in 2023, where GDP was in that 3%, in 2024, where the economy was operating stronger than expected. Both the Federal Reserve and private economists are also anticipating this year that growth will remain positive, so avoiding a recessionary environment, but however, not operating at above our theoretical pace and being somewhat maintaining its positivity. On the labor market side, there are continued expectations that the labor market will remain loose. However, in loose by meaning payroll growth is expected to continue to be positive and outright avoid layoffs. However, there's certainly signs that the labor market is experiencing a number of challenges that will be expected to continue throughout 2025 with, unemployment claims being different, again, job growth month to month, a lot of volatility around that front. And then lastly, what's really been transpired from an outright yields perspective, as we've seen in the last, talking points, is really we've seen the two-year Treasury drop a lot as they anticipated and saw the Fed was realizing those interest rate cuts drop down to about 3.54% from last September. And then since September, we've certainly seen a rebound with interest rates increasing, market interest rates increasing, whether that's 2-year, 3-year, or 5-year Treasury rates from the recent lows. And we'll kind of get into, as we continue to go through the slides, as to really the why behind why rates have moved recently higher. So as we flip over to the next slide, really start to dive into each one of those components in some more detail. So what this slide is demonstrating is looking at where the market is pricing in or expecting in terms of the federal funds policy rate at the end of December 2025. And as you can really go from left to right, if you go to that peak, this is back in April of 2024, where the market was anticipating by the end of 2025, the policy rate getting to that 4.5%. And certainly we've evolved significantly lower from there. But as we started to see the Fed reduce the policy rate. The market really started to get ahead of itself in terms of expecting by the end of 2025 that the policy rate will be closer to that 2.75%. However, over this last quarter, through a number of different reasons, as we'll naturally get into, between change in expectations for growth being resilient, inflation being somewhat sticky in the back half of 2024, the market started to change and expecting not necessarily by the end of 2025 we'll get to below 3%, but the Fed might start to reduce the pace at which they're cutting interest rates. And we'll certainly see, as we'll go into this, the policy changes being from the new administration also having a significant influence over some uncertainty that resides throughout 2025. And then in the next slide, focusing in more on the inflation front, as previously mentioned, the top half is looking at the year-over-year number. So we certainly back half of 2024, the CPI year-over-year was well above the Fed's 2% target. Year-over-year being in at 3.5%, 3.4%, but certainly throughout the summer months, inflation continued to edge lower, giving the Fed confidence that their policy rate was overly restricted. So needing them to start to adjust their policy rate lower. That's when we started to get those rate cuts in September and November. And that's really a function of how much inflation was improving. However, as we got to that October and November time periods, we started to see some of the inflation figures were representing a level of stickiness, and we started to see year-over-year numbers tick back up a little bit. That started to get both the market and the Fed to realize, yeah, maybe it was really important and critical for managing their policy to get from 5.5 and reducing to a whole 1% over 2024. But at this point, given the stickiness of inflation, their thinking was it may be appropriate to slow the pace and not reduce rates by 0.5% at a meeting or 0.25% at every meeting. They could be a little bit more deliberate and see how their policy is influencing the economy throughout the first part of 2025. But broadly, as I mentioned, the economists, and as we look at the underlying data, there's significant evidence that we're going to continue to see the trends of inflation to be aligned along the lines of getting closer to that 2% here throughout 2025.
Jason, we're closer to the end of January now. I know that this was prepared kind of before we got to that place, but do you have a picture of what December 24 looks like?
Yeah, so we prepared this right, as you mentioned, right before the CPI release came out, and then the CPI actually for December came in favorably from both a year-over-year perspective and also a month-to-month. And then underneath the surface of the underlying components is a really welcoming sign as relates to housing services and shelter costs. We saw strong evidence of the rate of change in that sector, which has been a really large contributing factor to keep inflation high. Actually came in below expectations and was certainly well received within the marketplace. Again, further evidence that over time we'll continue to get closer to that 2%.
Good, thanks.
Mm-hmm. Then as we go to the next slide, looking at, again, back to the growth story is, focusing on the middle of this chart, which represents the real GDP on a quarter-to-quarter basis that are then annualized. We certainly saw after the opening of the pandemic where GDP was averaging that 5, 6, 7% at its peak. We started to see some normalization with 2022 and 2023 with GDP in that 2.5 to 3% in some quarters, a little bit more elevated at 4.4. 2024 was a little bit different. We certainly seen growth slow down at different time periods, and really broadly from what's transpiring with expectations and what we realized in 2024 is the labor market's cooling, economic activity is slowing down modestly. So it's leading to economists expecting GDP for 2025 to be lower than it was in 2024. However, it will not be without a lot of uncertainty, given we have a new administration. There's a lot of policies that will be proposed and will certainly influence both the growth side of the equation and also the inflation picture. That's clouding some of the forecasts, but it's broadly everybody's expecting, given how much policy has been elevated and how activity has been slowing throughout 2024 and expected to continue here in 2025 with GDP in that hovering around that 2% area. And very similarly, the Fed's own forecasts are also aligned with private economists' forecasts, with GDP being lower than it was in the prior year.
May I ask a question? So the real GDP, is that corrected every year for inflation? So it's in, so that there's no inflation component in these growth numbers?
Exactly. This is reducing the inflation impact to the growth measurement.
Thanks.
And then the next slide is going to give a picture. Again, there's a lot of different ways we look at the labor market, and this one is of a particular interest. And this is looking at the sort of this teal color is looking at initial jobless claims. So the first time somebody files for unemployment insurance, and the orange line is looking at the number of people who are continuing to file for unemployment insurance. And you can see on the left-hand side, there's been a lot of changes from the initial number of people filing for claims each week, where we've peaked in May 2023 over 250,000 jobs in number of people in a given week. It's came down throughout 2023, and then 2024 that continued to move up higher. But a big change here in 2024 was we started to see a rebound with the number of people filing for unemployment insurance has started to come down on a weekly basis. But a big thing a big theme that's been emerging is, given how much looser the labor market has become in terms of the number of people being hired per month, the unemployment rate increasing, the number of jobs opening up has been being reduced. This orange line is showing that if you were to lose your job, it's becoming increasingly more difficult to obtain a new one, which really goes back to speaking to how loose the labor market has become in 2024 and to start this year. And that's a big contrast to 2023 and in parts of 2024 when the labor market was tight and that was impacting inflation in a negative way. This is another sign that, yes, inflation's been bumpy, but the labor market is operating in a way that's not consistent with any potential increase in demand that could result in a rebound in inflation that could be worrisome from a policy perspective. So just another angle to look at broadly the conditions for Fed policy actions and what's going on in the marketplace. This one's showing, again, given that claims is elevated for continuing claims, the rebound in inflation and growth is certainly not going to be found in this picture. And then the next one, I'm going to zoom in a little bit here more regionally and locally. So this is a slide that's looking at the national unemployment rate in addition to the state of Ohio's unemployment rate. And then that dark line will be looking at the unemployment rate within the county. And positively over this last quarter, the dark blue line representing the county's unemployment rate has certainly been below the national average unemployment rate, and then also within the state of Ohio. So county certainly experiencing a more robust unemployment or employment market than the rest of the state, and then more nationally across the country. And then the next one before we round out the economic update this is a slide looking at, again, the change in some of the market interest rates. The teal line looking at the 2-year treasury and its evolution since June of 2023, excuse me. And then the orange line looking at the federal funds rate. You can see the important pieces are the 2-year treasury peaked around August, September, October 2023 over 5%, and has been steadily declining over time. Somewhat volatility along the way, just given the data will change from a month-to-month perspective. However, this last through September through December, as again the inflation numbers kind of ticked up as we've shown previously. New administration, there's a little bit more uncertainty as some of the Fed policy path, whether they'll cut 1 time, 2 time, or even more than 2 throughout 2025. We start to see some of the longer term interest rates increase to reflect that reality. But really importantly, as we zoom out and look at the some of the continued value of investing out in the fixed income markets is even at 4.25 or 4.5 2-year treasury, that's well above the 20-year average of the 2-year treasury, which has historically been about 200 basis points or 2%. So it's still able to continue to pick up a lot of value going out on investing out in the yield curve for the U.S. Treasury market. And with that, any questions?
I suppose the only one I sort of have some question about is because we've had a transition in administration and kind of a different philosophical approach to markets. I think we're anticipating something in the first half of this year vis-a-vis changes to tax policy, potentially tariff policy, et cetera. I don't know if you can speak to that kind of broadly and when we should look for impacts in this space. I know this is kind of very speculative, right? But I'm just curious if you have a read on kind of where that might be going. I know there was some news from the Fed today that we're kind of in a stand pat mode for the moment, but just curious about kind of broad level impacts from administration change.
Yeah, so naturally, one of the big questions that is facing the markets, and we certainly think about a lot, is the idea of tariffs and how that will influence the broad inflation picture. Academically, and also a lot of data that we looked at from the prior administration with Trump, where the tariffs were enacted. Tariffs tend to be a one-time change in the price level and not something that's persistent, where you get a consecutive change that comes forth within the CPI numbers. And more importantly, as we looked at last time the administration was around, when we had tariffs, those tariffs were actually absorbed, and that cost was being absorbed by corporations in the form of lower margins, and then didn't come forth directly to a tax on consumers. Now, naturally, one of the things we're certainly looking at, and everybody else similarly, is the scope of tariffs can be a little bit different. However, so far from this administration, some of the announcements, there's been a difference between the campaign announcements versus what there's been conversations and policy being put forth right now, where tariffs are not necessarily going to be broad-based and there might be more gradual. So a thing that they're considering is, instead of doing a one-time tariff on, let's call it everybody globally, they might do a more phased-in approach to be very conscious of not inciting any inflationary pressures. In addition, I think the administration's talked a lot about is trying to balance any inflation impact with really focusing on policies that can help on the energy side, and that energy relief will also come forth with keeping inflation on its proper trajectory going forward.
Okay, thank you very much. Stuff we'll be monitoring, obviously,
Yeah.
over the next year plus. So, any other questions about the economic outlook before we talk about the core portfolio? All right, thanks.
Okay, so transitioning over to the portfolio review, we will start as we normally do. The portfolio ended the year at just under $850 million. It was a slight reduction from the prior quarter. As we had mentioned in the Q3 IAC meeting report, there were some expected expenditures that were going to come out of the portfolio, which did in fact happen. Those changes within the portfolio ultimately ended in the middle left of the page. The weighted average maturity as of year-end 24 was right at 2.5 years. The weighted average yield, just under 3%, 2.92%, which puts the estimated annual income at just under $25 million, again, for the core portfolio only. Looking to the upper right, the overall allocation, the overall emphasis within the portfolio continues to be on U.S. Treasury and agency securities, as you'll see in the donut chart, making up nearly 85% of the overall portfolio allocation, with the rest of the allocation being rounded out primarily within high-quality corporate notes, and then small segments within both municipal and foreign securities. The maturity distribution down at the bottom, not really significantly changed from the prior quarter. As noted again, most all of the maturities that occurred within the fourth quarter were used to meet those anticipated expenditures that went out before year end. We ended the year, we have just at 25% of the portfolio that is planned maturity within the next 1 year. And we have the allocations out into the 4 to 5 year allocation, with a small allocation out beyond 5 years, specifically noted to the parking garage project that was done a number of years ago. So from a focus standpoint, our tying back the financial and economic comments earlier, our emphasis remains on when there is opportunity for reinvestment, we are focusing out into longer-term maturities with the idea of locking in these rates for as long as we can. Any questions on the core portfolio before we move on to continued view?
Don't see
Switching
any.
to the next slide, just the year-end view. Again, seeing the portfolio trending up since the rate movements that Jason Szabo described historically. The overall portfolio has increased year over year from the lows of under 1% back in 2021 when we were in a much lower rate environment, now approaching the 3% mark as we ended 2024. On the next slide, looking at compliance, all of the metrics of the allocation and compliance to the investment policy are all meeting their compliance requirements, so no challenges or issues there. And then viewing on the next slide, historical performance comparisons. Now we stop and we talk about this in each case. We have the county's portfolio, which we just described, ending the year at 2.29% yield to maturity, comparing against three different benchmarks and or points of comparison. Star Ohio, which came up earlier, being again evidenced by overnight short-term rates. Star Ohio was yielding at the end of the year 4.6%. The legacy benchmark used for the portfolio, which is the 2-year average of the 2-year treasury. So again, a little shorter average maturity than the way that the portfolio is operated today, coming in at 4.48%. The most representative benchmark of the portfolio being the 0 to 5-year US Treasury Index came in with a yield to maturity of 2.56. So again, well below where the county's portfolio ended the year at 2.92. Before transitioning over to the opioid settlement, any questions overall, allocation-wise, maturity distribution-wise, or yield-wise?
No.
Hearing none, we will transition over to the opioid settlement portfolio. So running through similarly as we did to the core portfolio, the total portfolio ended the year at just over $63 million. The weighted average maturity at right around, again, the 2.5-year mark, coming in slightly higher than the core at 2.62. The weighted average yield at 3.48, which corresponds to estimated annual income of just over $2 million. Of note here, going back and providing that direct comparison to the core portfolio, two factors coming into play on the opioid settlement portfolio being at a higher yield than the core. One being the timing of when the opioid settlement investments began. The yields were much higher when we put that initial cash to work. And the second being the ability to take portions of this portfolio out a little longer, which you see represented in the bottom chart, with 30% of the portfolio being allocated out into the 4 to 5 year maturity bucket. Those certainly benefiting given the rate environment and giving us the ability to lock those rates in a little longer in significantly higher chunk given the expected expenditure of the opioid settlement fund. Again, similar trend to the core, the overall emphasis being on U.S. government treasury and agency securities, making up in this case more than 95% of the overall portfolio, with the remainder being allocated to a portion of commercial paper. And then transitioning to the last slide, the compliance review. Just as with the core, all metrics of the opioid settlement fund remain within their appropriate compliance standards. I'll stop there and open to any questions on the opioid settlement fund.
All right, gentlemen, thank you. Anybody have any questions for the meter team? And if not, may I have a motion to accept the portfolio presentation as presented?
Move to accept.
Okay,
Second.
Moved and seconded. Any discussion? Hearing none, all in favor, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. No opposition or abstention, so that motion carries. All right, thank you very much, gentlemen. That moves us into the next portion of our agenda for this afternoon. That would be a review of our investment policy generally and setting of a meeting schedule. If it's not objected to by anyone on the committee, I'd like to move link deposits to the end, just as a note. So, just by way of reminder, Ohio Revised Code has some rules vis-a-vis the organization of the Investment Advisory Committee, part of which is the membership as well as the election of officers of the board. Membership in Cuyahoga County, because we are a charter organization, is slightly different than the ORC, but consists of the treasurer, a representative of council, and the county executive. So representative from council for this term will be Councilman Dale Miller. We're happy to have you, Councilman Miller, joining us on this body. It is also practice for us to designate alternates in the event that we are not able to attend. I understand council has designated Trevor McAleer for that purpose, and the executive has designated Katie Gallagher for that purpose. So just for purpose of documenting that in the record so that we've got that set. So having said that, I would like at this time to move into the election of officers. Again, as I'd mentioned, there are three, because there are three of us, a chair, a vice chair, and a secretary, and I would take nominations at this time for a chair of the committee.
I nominate the treasurer, Brad Cromus, as the chair.
Okay, thank you.
Second.
All right, moved and seconded. Any other nominations? Any other nominations? Any other nominations? Seeing that there are none, nominations are now closed, and I will take a vote on that. So all in favor of naming me chair, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
No abstentions or objections. Not that mine would matter anyway, but I appreciate that. So thank you very much. Vice chair, then, might take a nomination for vice chair of the committee. Rock, paper, scissors works too. We can do that.
Yeah, I will nominate Chris Ronayne as the vice chair.
All right. Moved. Is there a second?
Second.
All right, seconded. Any other nominations? Any other nominations? Any other nominations? Seeing none, all in favor, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye, and no objections or abstentions. So the motion carries for the executive to serve as the vice chair. I would like to nominate the county council representative, Mr. Miller, to be the secretary of the committee for purposes of our organization.
Second.
Moved and seconded. Any objections or abstentions? Any other nominations times three? Okay, seeing none, the nominations are closed. All in favor, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. And no objections or abstentions. So we now have our officers for the board. Congratulations. Thank you. Or for the committee, excuse me. Moving on then to the next substantive piece, we also are required, I think by statute, or at least by best practice, to review our investment policy on an annual basis. Typically, this takes place at the annual meeting. My staff and I have undertaken quite a bit of work on our investment policy, along with our friends from Meter, to look at best practices and to update the policy. The last substantive update of which was made some time ago, April 2021. So in the packet you have received before the meeting is a summary of the proposed changes to the policy. Those are broken into substantive and stylistic categories. The stylistic ones are ones you can imagine would fall into that category: letterhead, removal of a table of contents, which we saw as superfluous, restyling headers and titles, and some grammatical and formatting changes throughout the policy. Substantive changes include consolidating the purpose statement to emphasize where the investment authority sits, adding sections on membership meetings and minutes to reflect the contents of the Ohio Revised Code in our practice, a section on policy revision and adoption, a section on rule of law, a section on prudence and the release of liability that explains what the standard of prudence is to reflect current Ohio Revised Code language, an expanded ethics and conflicts of interest section referring to various sources of authority, an updated scope of investment policy that tightens the language therein, expanded investment objectives sections to include a description of our objectives and to add a piece on sustainability, including language explicitly authorizing our link deposit programs, consolidating our delegation of authority and investment advisory committee sections into procedures limitations, so a little bit of a reordering, removing specific provisions of authorized investments that were pulled directly from the ORC at the time of adoption and replacing them with a section that's broader about authorizations from the ORC to provide us some flexibility. Adding link deposits to the portfolio diversification table, again, to reflect that we actually do those. Reviewing our maximum maturity section because those concepts are incorporated elsewhere in the policy. Adjusting the average maturity target in the prohibited investments and investment practices section to provide clearer guardrails that more accurately reflect the world in which we operate. That's something that Jason mentioned in the presentation regarding that target piece. Consolidating some language, and I think that more or less summarizes the summary. So having said all of that, I believe we're ready for a motion to approve the changes to the policy, and I would take that in any discussion related.
Move we approve the changes to the investment policy.
Okay, that is moved.
Second.
Moved and seconded. Thank you. Any discussion?
Yes, I have a couple of questions.
Sure.
First, could you provide a little more discussion about the adjustments that were made to the maximum maturity targets, which is an important factor in the policy?
Right, thank you. So those are contained, let me see where I just ran through that quickly. In the prohibited investments and investment practices is where that lands now. That change was to update language that had carried forward from a number of other revisions with that 24-month moving average of the two-year treasury. That's not really a very accurate reflection of the market that we look at. Ours is more accurately reflected by that 5-year figure. And I noted it here, whereas it's in the actual policy itself. I believe, and Jason maybe can chime in here a little bit. One of the Jasons on why that figure is a bit better one for us. But as we've kind of had these conversations and looking at the line chart that's presented in Meter's presentation, it's pretty clear the portfolio has never been performing anywhere close to the target. In part because it was the wrong target, at least in recent history. So I don't know, if Jason, if you want to add more to that. I think that's kind of the broad strokes of why we made that change, but you may have more to add substantively to that.
Yep, and looking at that, the target there is really focusing on the rather than the 2-year moving average of the 2-year treasury, like Brad said, it is now a 0 to 5-year treasury index that we'll be looking at, that it takes a snapshot every single day of essentially what the whole market is from 0 to 5 years. And we'll be looking at that over a 5-year period. So really trying to look over the full market cycle. How's it performing from there? The additional guardrails, I believe, are the minimum and maximum weighted average maturity limits. That's right. Which are now 1 year to 3 years, which we've been within that over the course of the last 10 years or so. So really, and I believe there's language in there too, that under normal market conditions. So that's how we should operate, but it does allow the flexibility that if we needed to be shorter because of cash flow constraints, that it would allow the county to take advantage of that.
Thank you, Jason. Yeah, phrased another way as he was speaking, it came to me that we are investing in the 0 to 5-year bucket in the portfolio, not a 0 to 2-year bucket. So it makes more sense for us to look at a 5-year horizon versus just the 2-year horizon.
Yeah.
So, I understand that there's a section related to what actions we take and what evaluations we make if a bond gets downgraded. Can you point out that section and explain what it does?
Yeah, I'd be happy to point that out. So that section provides some actual description. It's on page 6 under monitoring and adjusting the portfolio, the third paragraph. And that is a new provision that requires us in the event of a downgrade of a credit rating of a security in the portfolio to have staff report that downgrade to the treasurer without undue delay. It does not mandate the sale of that security, but requires an evaluation of the current situation of the issuer in the context of market price, time to maturity, and impact on the portfolio. All things we'll consider in deciding whether or not to sell or hold the security. And then unspoken in that, obviously, is to reinvest. So it also says that any such security will be periodically reevaluated as conditions change until the security either matures or is sold. So more or less a recitation of current practice, but it does require us to do that. And part of the thought process there is it makes clear to the folks that we are holding this money on behalf of, that we are doing that, and kind of gives a little bit of description of what that looks like.
So my understanding is that our portfolio is designed to be very low risk.
That's right.
We're not we're not speculators. Our plan is to invest in very safe investments where our capital is safe, and I know that the Israel bonds have already been downgraded on a couple of occasions, and the question I would like to direct to the Meter Group is whether in their opinion, the Israel bonds are the highest risk bonds that we're currently holding in the portfolio, or are there other holdings that we have that for other reasons carry higher risks?
Question, Jason Zabo, do you want to step in and address that specific question?
Yeah, so from a ratings perspective, Israel will be the lower ratings compared to any other investment within the portfolio.
So being lower rated, it would carry higher risk. Would that be accurate?
Yeah, in the judgment of the rating agencies, yes.
Okay. The other comment that I have is about the sustainability section, and which I do support, and it reflects that investment return is not the only consideration, that it's also a consideration of what the entity that we're investing in what it does, how it performs, how it interacts with its environment, and what it contributes to sustainability or does not. And so I think it's important to note that these considerations are relevant, that we don't live on an island where what we do doesn't affect what everybody else does. And so I support this language, and for both questions of investment risk and sustainability, I think the Israel bonds are going to require careful scrutiny going forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilman. I would echo that. I appreciate your comment on the sustainability section, and it's page 4, section 5, if anyone is looking at that. So just to give a little bit of additional color to the inclusion of that, we scoured the country to try to determine what kind of information might be applicable to an investment policy in this space. with the help of our friends at Meter. So I want to thank them for their assistance in that effort. This language is drawn in part from the state of Illinois' investment policy and speaks to considerations around corporate governance, environmental factors, human capital factors, business model factors, and again, speaks to the fact that those things are things that we pay attention to as a county. We also have some language regarding materiality and kind of contextualizing our consideration of those things in the scope of the portfolio and the economic conditions that we consider more broadly. But I just wanted to point that out. I'm happy that my staff was able to do that, and I think that we did a pretty good job of trying to square the circle there, so I appreciate your calling that out. Any further comments or questions? Okay, seeing none, may I please have a vote? All in favor of approving the policy as presented, please say aye.
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 Aye. No objections or abstentions. That motion carries. Thank you very much. Next item of business on the agenda would be, I'm going to again go other business first, the meeting schedule for 2025 you have in front of you there. For purposes of the record, our plan at the moment is to meet on a quarterly basis on April 24th, July 16th, October 14th, and then again on January 9th of 2026. So those will be posted publicly shortly, just for purposes of everyone's information. Unless otherwise listed, those will be in this room at 2 o'clock, I believe. We haven't stated that in this, but that is our expectation, right?
Correct, and they already are posted.
Okay, fantastic, thank you. And then the last item on... Yes,
2
sir.
o'clock for both, all meetings.
Yeah, unless otherwise noted, or we need to have some kind of
Okay,
yeah.
fine.
And then the last item is just to give you all an update on our conversations regarding link deposits. This is the tool by which we can use a portion of the county's investment portfolio to invest in local public policy initiatives. We currently have Heritage Home and HELP that exist that we continue to lend under, so we want to make sure everyone is aware that those continue to be available from our partners at Key and at Huntington. We continue to have conversations with other banking institutions and other governmental entities in the state on partnerships that may make sense in that space. So we had a very good call today with the Treasurer of State's office, have had some conversations around what that relationship might look like vis-a-vis leveraging this tool to do more for homeowners and small businesses in our community. We're going to have similar conversations in the coming weeks with our municipal partners in the county. So we continue to look for ways to use that tool more effectively, and hopefully we'll have more to share on that as the year progresses. I do have one other note on small business, or on other business, if you'll indulge. I'd like to just note for the good of the order, we did recently make an investment in some manuscript debt around the Gateway project. So just want to make sure that we're aware that that is something that we're doing. Again, leveraging our local investment portfolio to do some positive things and support projects that help our community locally. So anything you'd like to add to that before
Yes. In the last quarter, we also acquired some debt to help out a local community within Cuyahoga County.
That's right. Yes,
So I
thank you
just
very
want
much
to make
for that.
sure that, we are investing in the community when it's available. When we hear about it, we have invested in one of our local communities within Cuyahoga County.
Yeah, we look for municipal debt where possible. Absolutely. Yeah, thank you. Anything else for the good of the order? Anything else to bring up under other business? Hearing none, may I have a motion to adjourn?
Move to adjourn.
Second.
Okay, adjourned and seconded, and without objection, we are adjourned. We will see you all in April. Thank you.